Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Tennessee Valley. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. This is a case file assembled from county archives, fragmented newspaper clippings, and oral testimonies, centering on a young girl named Nora Whitaker, who arrived in the Tennessee Valley in the spring of 1914. Over the following months, she became the subject of whispered lore, the girl who outsmarted every scientist. Yet the paper trail is full of gaps, contradictions, and strange anomalies. In the records of Hancock County, Tennessee, bordering Virginia, Nora's arrival is logged in a sparse travel ledger. On April 12, 1914, she came by rail to the small town of Ponding, a modest stop just off the Clinch River line. The ledger notes, Miss N. Whitaker, destination, unnamed property in the hills. Local constable J.B. McCarty later wrote in a marginal note, no previous address, spoke of hidden work in northern counties. The Tennessee Valley's geography looms over all of this. The region, defined by the watershed of the Tennessee River and its tributaries, interlinks dozens of small mountain valleys and hollows. The valley zone had long been a place of isolation, many farmsteads accessible only by unpaved tracks and narrow creek fords. That isolation meant that rumors traveled faster than facts. We'll return later to how the valley's peculiar geography shaped investigations and the sensitive role the broader Tennessee Valley context played in local memory. Nora's first weeks passed quietly. She took residence in a small, ramshackle house on a remote stretch of timberland just upstream from Ponding, on land once part of the Melrose family estate. County deed records show the property was transferred under an alias, N. Whitcomb, in early 1914. The vendor was one Elias Paxton, whose trail becomes cold in the archives. Observers from neighboring farms describe Nora as demure, pale, with dark hair, often seen at dusk wandering along the ridgeline, notebook in hand. One neighbor, Mrs. Adeline Sterling, supplied an affidavit. She looked not a child, not yet a woman, with a gaze as though always watching a clock nobody else sees. That same affidavit mentions that Nora carried small glass vials and sketched contour lines in the dirt. No local physician had treated her in those early days. The small settlement of Ponding had no resident scientist or academic presence. But rumors circulated of her corresponding with external investigators, unnamed doctors of the North, and sending cryptic letters to laboratories in Knoxville and Chattanooga. The first odd incident occurred late June. A boy named Samuel Rives, aged 10, vanished from a neighboring farm overnight. He was last seen playing near the creek with a wooden box Nora had loaned him. The next morning, Nora told Mrs. Sterling that the boy had gone downstream to fetch a specimen from a rock ledge. Search parties found no trace. County Constable McCarty documented the search in his logbook. Rives missing, no sign of struggle, no footprints beyond Creek Bend. The log continues. Mrs. Whitaker cooperative, allowed search of premises, basement dry, no hidden door. That first disappearance marked the turning point. Locals began to whisper that she was a prodigy in secret disciplines, chemistry, geology, perhaps something darker. By midsummer of 1914, the Whitaker name had become a quiet riddle across the Tennessee Valley. Farmers coming into town for supplies would trade theories at the depot, some claiming she was an orphaned academic from a northern college, others insisting she'd been sent to map mineral deposits for private investors. No one could agree. But everyone remembered how Nora seemed to know things she shouldn't. The depths of wells, the age of timber, the precise hours when the fog would lift from the valley floor. Letters later recovered from the Ponding post office revealed that Nora was corresponding under multiple return addresses. One envelope bore the stamp of Knoxville, another of Huntsville, both addressed to fictitious professors. Inside, she requested further data on nocturnal mineral luminescence, a term that puzzled the investigators who reviewed the case decades later. Local lore eventually folded her story into tales of wartime experimentation, though this predated the First World War's real reach into the region. In late July, a second incident unsettled the valley. A traveling peddler, Frank Darrow, failed to arrive at his next stop after visiting the Whitaker property. His wagon was found a mile down the creek bed, horse still tied, wheels sunken into soft clay. The county sheriff's report, dated July 30th, noted only, "No signs of theft, money and goods intact." Witnesses who gathered to inspect the scene reported faint chemical odors in the air, something like phosphorus or turpentine. One man, Eli Moore, later told a reporter that a kind of pale mist rose from the ground when the horse stamped. When questioned, Nora said the man had left before dusk, heading toward the river junction. She added, almost clinically, "The creek changes direction after heavy rain. He may have lost his way." Her tone, several witnesses recalled, was steady, unnervingly so, and she offered tea to the sheriff and calmly suggested they check an abandoned limestone shaft behind the Paxton field. No one found anything there except broken jars and wet chalk fragments. The sheriff's deputy, a man named Harlan Birch, filed a follow-up note 3 days later. "Young lady displays no distress, claims to have studied flow paths of ground fogs, states she is compiling a field atlas of light behavior in air. Requests official access to courthouse survey maps." His handwriting stops abruptly, and the next line reads only, "Denied until further inquiry." By August, the valley was restless. A notice in the Knoxville Sentinel briefly mentioned unusual phenomena reported near Ponding, comparing it to the strange light sometimes observed near Muscle Shoals, further down the Tennessee Valley. That region, later known for massive hydroelectric developments, had long been associated with curious atmospheric effects. It's possible that connection and the fame of the valley itself helped scientists take notice years later, but by then Nora Whitaker had already vanished from official record. Neighbors said she was last seen on the evening of August 22nd, walking toward the ridge under a thunderstorm, carrying a lantern that glowed blue instead of yellow. When the rain stopped, her light was gone. The next morning, only her notebooks remained, sealed in a tin chest beneath the porch. Each page filled with geometric patterns, weather notations, and a recurring phrase in the margins, "to see what others cannot." When the first investigators reopened the Whitaker property in early September, the air had already turned damp with the seasonal rains that roll through the Tennessee Valley each autumn. Deputy Birch, joined by 2 county surveyors, entered the cabin at dawn. They found the interior stripped of nearly everything except a writing desk, a few vials, and one small iron stove. Birch noted that the walls bore faint burn marks in circular patterns. Not flame, he wrote, but heat drawn somehow inward. The surveyors uncovered a small, locked cellar beneath the back room, sealed with a hatch of welded tin. Inside were 3 crates, one of glass samples labeled river sediment, another of animal bones, and a third containing only folded sheets of graph paper. On these, Nora had traced precise curves and figures, each corresponding to the topography of nearby hills. The marks glowed faintly when held under lamplight. "Like the reflections off fish scales," one man said, uneasy. The notes beside them described luminal resonance, a term decades ahead of its time. The sheriff contacted Knoxville, requesting a scientific inspection. A chemist named Dr. Julian Wren came down in mid-September. His report, later filed with the state archives, concluded that the glow came from simple phosphorescence, perhaps minerals disturbed by floodwater. But he also remarked that the patterns seemed deliberate, as if someone had mapped the very light. That line alone kept the file circulating among academics for years afterward. Meanwhile, local fear deepened. Parents forbade their children from walking near the Whitaker property. Preacher Leland Hodge mentioned her name in a Sunday sermon, warning of those who study what the Lord chose to hide. The same week, a letter arrived from a man in Alabama claiming to have met Nora 2 years earlier near Muscle Shoals, where she was taken by measures of reflected sound. His account suggested she'd been traveling through the broader Tennessee Valley long before her official arrival, following invisible patterns, perhaps of her own making. By October, strange fires began to appear across the ridges. Not wildfires, but small flickering orbs of light, seen hovering low over the fields. Some blamed swamp gas, others said it was her work continuing without her. Deputy Birch organized night watches. One witness, a teacher named Mildred Carver, recorded in her diary, "The light wavered, then divided in two, then vanished. No heat, no smoke." Her entry ended simply, "I think she's still here." Weeks later, Birch himself left town without notice. His badge and revolver were found inside the old rail depot, neatly placed on a bench. In the sheriff's log, one note follows in a different hand. Deputy B stated he understood now how she did it. No further explanation. He was never seen again. The Whitaker property was officially sealed that winter, 1914. The county marked it as uninhabitable after a second-floor collapse, though no one had entered since the investigation. The following spring, the creek overflowed and erased the last visible trail to her home. And yet, decades later, children of Ponding still spoke of a dim light that moved through the trees each storm season, the same color as the lantern she carried that night. The winter of 1914 settled heavily over the Tennessee Valley, bringing long nights and frost that turned the creek banks to stone. With most farms focused on survival, the story of Nora Whitaker faded into rumor, buried under the demands of the season. But official files tell a quieter story, that state inspectors returned in February 1915 to assess flood damage and found something the sheriff's men had missed. Beneath the collapsed flooring of Nora's cabin lay a second chamber, smaller and built with precision that no local carpenter could have managed. The entry was cut into the bedrock, lined with slate and sealed with tar. Inside were tools, unlike anything common to the valley. Lenses, thin metal rods, even fragments of a primitive electrical coil. None of it matched the resources available in Hancock County at the time. The inspectors cataloged the items, then sealed them in storage at the Knoxville courthouse. That evidence later disappeared during a courthouse fire in 1921. Among the few surviving papers is a single memo by an assistant clerk. Instruments of unknown purpose, possibly for atmospheric study. His handwriting falters midway, then concludes, "All bearing marks of careful construction by hand. No manufacturer noted." This note, dry and technical, became the last confirmed artifact tied to Nora Whitaker. Meanwhile, the valley's folk memory transformed her into something less human. Oral accounts collected in the 1930s under the Federal Writers Project mention the girl who built a light underground, a figure said to walk rivers at night, calling to lost children. These stories are often confused with local ghost tales, but the dates and geography match too neatly to dismiss. Even then, witnesses described strange blue flares over the old property each spring flood, always brief, never caught on photograph. A school teacher named Horace Lang, who documented regional legends, later found a faded telegram referencing Nora's early correspondences. It had been sent from a research group near Oak Ridge decades before that site's wartime transformation. The telegram simply read, "Inquiry received. Subject shows extraordinary insight into natural luminescence. Further contact ill-advised." Historians debate whether this message was genuine or a forgery placed after her myth took root. Yet the phrasing echoes earlier state reports describing her knowledge of the unseen. In recalling these events, one cannot ignore the broader context of the Tennessee Valley, a region where isolation often hid brilliance and tragedy in equal measure. Before the modern developments that reshaped its rivers and ridges, this land trapped its stories within itself. Floods washing over evidence, silt burying secrets faster than they could be unearthed. By 1916, only a few aging residents of Ponding remembered Nora clearly. One of them, Adeline Sterling, who had first met her upon arrival, told a journalist that she still dreamed of Nora standing in the doorway, holding a book open to blank pages that glowed faintly in the dark. "She wasn't wicked," Sterling said softly. "She just saw the world in another color, one we can't stand to look at for long." It is from those fading recollections that the record of Nora Whitaker ends. But the disturbances in the hills, the flickering fires that refused to die out, continued well into the following decade. By the spring of 1917, when the war overseas had begun to dominate every headline, Ponding's sheriff at the time, Emmett Rawlins, reopened the Whitaker file. He had been newly elected, eager to prove himself as a man of modern law rather than mountain superstition. Rawlins ordered a thorough resurvey of the old Whitaker property and brought in a university man, Professor Lucian Greer of the Tennessee Polytechnic Institute, to study the remaining artifacts before they were lost to moisture and rot. Greer's report, now a brittle, water-stained document in the county's historical holdings, remains one of the few written assessments not colored by rumor. He described the cellar's design as mathematically sound, aligned with the ridge's natural arc, perhaps to observe refraction from valley fog. His sketches show lines converging precisely at magnetic north. Yet in a marginal note he added, "Certain materials respond to lamplight, as though remembering previous exposure." He refused to elaborate when pressed. Rawlins also interviewed those who had once known Nora. Mrs. Sterling, older now and weary, mentioned that the girl had once claimed, "The light in the ground hums if you listen long enough." Others said she would collect creek stones and polish them until they emitted a faint gleam at night. None of these recollections amounted to crime, but the unease in their tone hinted at something unresolved, the sense that her disappearance had not ended naturally. That summer, a drought gripped the Tennessee Valley. With the rivers low, scavengers explored the exposed beds for scrap metal. Two boys uncovered a rusted trunk near the old Paxton field, marked with the initials NWW. Inside were 3 sealed jars containing cloudy fluid and small bits of copper wire. When the jars were opened, the fluid released a sharp odor and left a faint luminescent residue on the boys' hands. They were brought to the clinic in Rogersville, both recovered, though the physician recorded temporary confusion and trembling. The jars were later confiscated by county officers and, according to one shipping manifest, sent to a laboratory in Nashville. No report followed. By 1918, most of the region's attention had turned to the influenza outbreak. Entire families vanished under quarantine orders, and record-keeping suffered. It was during this chaos that Nora's name briefly surfaced again. A nurse at a temporary field hospital claimed a patient listed as N. Whitmore had been admitted with no identification, but spoke with a quiet northern accent and asked repeatedly for the ridge with the glass stones. The woman died the next day before confirmation could be made, and her body was interred with hundreds of others in an unmarked grave near the county line. Decades later, historians would compare the handwriting on that patient's admission form to the known letters of Nora Whitaker. The resemblance was uncanny. Same looping W, same precise spacing, yet the ink analysis placed the form's age slightly earlier than her disappearance, as if the record had been waiting for her before she was ever gone. In the decades that followed, the valley continued to evolve, but the small settlement of Ponding never regained its former population. The land grew wilder each year, and with it, the legend of the girl who heard the hum of light. By the early 1920s, the Tennessee Valley had begun to modernize in small but perceptible ways. Paved roads, telegraph lines, and rural electrification experiments creeping into towns that once seemed untouched by time. Yet Ponding remained stubbornly unchanged. Its people spoke of the ridge lights with lowered voices, and travelers noticed how few stayed after sundown. In 1922, a field geologist named Albert Keene visited the area while mapping limestone deposits for the State Survey. His field journal, preserved in the University of Tennessee archives, records something curious. On May 17th, while camping near the old Whitaker tract, he noted, at approximately 2:15 a.m., a faint blue emission seen over the tree line. Duration, less than 10 seconds. No sound, no combustion, no reflection. He initially dismissed it as lightning, but added the next night, occurred again at 2:12, pattern too consistent for weather. He left the site 2 days later, citing equipment malfunction due to humidity. Keene's observations resurfaced decades afterward, when researchers studying early regional folklore cross-referenced them with older sightings. The timing, always late spring, always near the flood season, matched descriptions from before Nora's disappearance. Some suggested underground chemical reactions, others remnants of phosphorescent minerals disturbed during the 1914 excavations. But those who lived nearby swore it was something else entirely. The earth breathes light where she once stood, an old farmer told a journalist in 1931. And it don't breathe it for anyone else. That same year, a schoolteacher named Miss Evelyn Rhodes reopened classes in the refurbished Ponding schoolhouse. She collected children's essays about local history and kept them bound in a ledger. One paper, written by a boy named Henry Cobb, described a woman in white standing by the crow, holding a jar that glowed like a star under water. He claimed his grandfather had seen her twice, decades apart, and that she always looked the same age. Miss Rhodes dismissed it as a retelling of the Whitaker tale, but she underlined the passage about the jar. That notebook, too, would later vanish from the county's archives after 1942. Even as the nation moved toward industrial growth, the Tennessee Valley carried its hidden pockets of the inexplicable. Before the great dam projects transformed its rivers, locals told stories of echoes that lasted too long, of light seen beneath water when no lanterns were near. The valley itself seemed to remember. In 1924, a new family settled near the old Whitaker land. They rebuilt a modest cabin using timbers salvaged from the ruins, unaware of their history. The father, a logger named Clarence Boyd, wrote to his sister that their nights were troubled by low humming from the ground, like distant machinery. He assumed it came from the river or telegraph lines, but his youngest daughter claimed she could see the sound, faint ripples in the air, forming circles where the creek once ran. Within months, they moved away, abandoning the cabin midwinter. Neighbors found it empty, the door locked from the inside. Afterward, the sheriff closed the property again, and a formal boundary was drawn across it on county maps. Restricted due to unstable ground. That note would remain printed in every edition of the survey until the 1950s. Few ever returned, except for stray hunters and the occasional drifter who left behind whispered accounts of a light that moves with the fog. By the late 1920s, the legend of Nora Whitaker had drifted beyond the Tennessee Valley itself. Traveling lecturers, those who made their living recounting local oddities and scientific marvels, began to include her name in their lists of unexplainable cases. One pamphlet printed in 1928 by a society calling itself the American Institute for the Study of Psychic Phenomena devoted an entire column to Miss N.W. of the Appalachian foothills, describing her as a prodigy of light frequencies. Though the tone mixed rumor with exaggeration, it was enough, however, to renew interest among a small circle of academics in Nashville and Atlanta. That same year, Dr. Lucian Greer, the same professor who had examined her cellar a decade earlier, was invited to give a lecture at Vanderbilt University. The notes from that event survive only in fragments, but one transcript reads, "If what we uncovered near Ponding was indeed of her making, then Miss Whitaker anticipated the principles of resonance long before the equipment existed to measure them." Greer was ridiculed by colleagues for that remark. Within months, he resigned his post and returned quietly to private research. His later correspondence was found decades afterward in an attic trunk, each letter containing hand-drawn diagrams of spirals and overlapping waves. Meanwhile, the valley endured one of its periodic floods. Heavy rains in the spring of 1929 washed through the hollows, uncovering parts of the old Paxton Field again. Witnesses from a relief crew reported unnatural gleam in the mud, a line of stones that seemed to shimmer independently of the sun. When the water receded, those stones were gone, buried again, or swept away. Only a single photograph remains, a blurred silver line across dark soil, taken by a local newspaperman who didn't realize what he'd captured until he developed the film weeks later. The people of Ponding spoke less and less of Nora by name. The older generation had passed, and the younger ones regarded her story as a cautionary myth. The woman who saw too much. But every few years, someone would mention the ridge lights again, and with each retelling, the details shifted slightly. Sometimes she was a scientist, sometimes a ghost, sometimes both. The truth lay somewhere between those two poles, buried under layers of fear and admiration. By the turn of the new decade, plans for regional development began to reach even this isolated corner. Surveyors from Washington spoke of harnessing the valley's waters for power, transforming the floods into energy. They could not have known that beneath those same waters, remnants of Nora's cellar still lingered, preserved perhaps in darkness. Later engineers would claim that their compasses spun erratically when they worked near the site. Some joked it was magnetism, others quietly requested reassignment. The Tennessee Valley, for all its beauty and progress, was still a place that guarded its mysteries, and among them, the faint hum that rose from the earth after each thunderstorm, never constant, never entirely gone, remained the most persistent of all. When the Tennessee Valley Authority was officially established in 1933, the region entered a new era. Bulldozers and engineers arrived from across the country, bringing light and order to what had long been described as the Forgotten Basin. But for those who lived near Ponding, the arrival of progress stirred a quiet dread. They said the valley didn't want to be tamed, and that the lights on the ridge would show themselves again before the first dam was finished. Official records show that in late September of that year, a construction crew surveying an access road near the old Whitaker tract experienced a ground disturbance. The foreman's report, preserved in TVA archives, describes the soil as breathing, rising and settling repeatedly over the course of several minutes, though no tremors were registered anywhere else. When the men dug into the mound, they found no gas pockets or sinkholes, only a network of smooth stones arranged in concentric rings, like the diagrams found in Nora's notebooks 2 decades earlier. The site was quietly sealed and marked unstable substructure. Do not excavate. That same week, a power station inspector, Everett Lomax, was stationed a few miles downstream. His personal journal, later recovered from his family's belongings, contains an entry dated October 2nd. Unusual static interference detected on night instruments. Lights flicker only in northern direction. Locals claim it's the girl's lantern. I'd laugh if it weren't for the fact that the signal spiked precisely every 73 seconds. Lomax's observation would later be dismissed as coincidence, though a TVA engineer interviewed in the 1950s confirmed that certain frequency anomalies persisted for decades in that region, inexplicable even after multiple equipment upgrades. Amid all this, the valley's older residents began to leave. Government relocation programs bought out much of the lowland property to make way for flood control projects. Ponding's few remaining houses were vacated by 1935, and the map was redrawn. The ridge that once held Nora Whitaker's home was slated for submersion under a new reservoir, though delays in funding left it untouched for several more years. Folklore, however, filled the vacuum left by the exodus. Workers told stories of hearing footsteps near their camps at night, soft, deliberate, as if pacing just beyond the perimeter lights. They joked about Miss Whitaker checking our math. Others claimed to see faint ripples of light beneath the river's surface at dawn, moving counter to the current. When a regional historian from Chattanooga, Mrs. Cora Wills, came to document local superstitions, she found that Nora's name had become interchangeable with the valley itself. "The folks speak of her as if she were geography," she wrote in her notebook, "not a person, but a feature of the land, a current that never quite leaves." And perhaps that was the truest description anyone could offer. Because long after the papers stopped mentioning her, and long after science claimed dominion over the Tennessee Valley, the lights kept returning, silent, rhythmic, patient. By the summer of 1936, the Tennessee Valley was changing faster than any local could remember. Surveyors, cartographers, and federal officials descended on the ridges with measuring instruments, clipboards, and cameras. They drew new boundaries for the lakes and flood zones. In doing so, they stumbled into what remained of the Whitaker site, though few knew the name anymore. The old cabin had long collapsed into the earth, its timbers reduced to splinters, but under a thin crust of soil, the workers found remnants that drew immediate curiosity. A young geologist named Harold Finn recorded the discovery in his notes. Partial foundation exposed, no sign of modern habitation. Found several jars embedded in clay, sealed with lead. Each contains what appears to be crystal powder, faintly luminescent in shade. He later tested the samples and concluded they were ordinary minerals infused with phosphoric compounds. Yet the results didn't explain why the glow persisted for hours after exposure to light. That same year, an old woman approached the site uninvited, identified only as Mrs. Sterling, the last living witness to Nora's early days. The foreman allowed her to look around. She moved slowly, touching the stones as if recognizing them by memory rather than sight. When asked what she remembered, she whispered, "She said the valley's bones could sing if we'd only listen." Then, before leaving, she warned them not to dig past the third ring of stones. Her words were written down, but the workers laughed them off. Within a week, one of the bulldozers operating near that ring collapsed into a shallow sink. No one was hurt, but the engine refused to restart despite mechanical inspection. The men refused to continue that section of work, insisting the ground hummed like a wasp hive when the machinery got too close. The incident went unreported in official TVA bulletins, though a short, unpublished memo in Finn's archive later confirmed the event. Around this time, Professor Greer, by then a recluse living in Franklin, wrote one final letter to the state archives. In it, he referenced the ongoing developments and pleaded for restraint. That property, he wrote, was once a study in what light remembers. If they bury it under the new reservoir, something will remain aware. His letter was never acknowledged, and he passed away the following year, leaving behind notebooks filled with overlapping circles that matched the geometry of the Whitaker cellar. The dam near Ponding was completed in 1938, and when the floodgates closed, the water rose steadily for weeks. By autumn, the valley floor lay submerged. Locals gathered on the ridge above to watch as the final rooftops disappeared beneath the surface. One by one, they said, faint ripples of bluish light shimmered across the water, small, like drifting lanterns. An observer from the Knoxville Journal dismissed it as electrical reflection from new power lines, but those who knew the land before the flood simply nodded. When the last ripple faded, the valley was quiet. For the first time in decades, no one spoke of the girl who outsmarted every scientist. But at night, fishermen claimed that the reservoir sometimes pulsed faintly, a rhythm steady as a heartbeat, coming from deep below. In the years that followed the 1938 flood, the Tennessee Valley grew prosperous under its new power grid. Towns once reliant on candlelight now glowed with steady electric hum, and the government celebrated what it called the triumph of progress over the past. But in Ponding, or what had been Ponding, progress carried a quiet irony. The reservoir that drowned its ruins also seemed to preserve something within it, a silence that locals said hummed if you stood still long enough. A retired dam engineer, Milton Ardery, later wrote an unpublished memoir about those early TVA years. In one chapter titled The Lights Beneath, he recalled a recurring disturbance in the reservoir. Every few weeks, a pulse rolled under the water, like a single breath released from the deep. We measured for gas eruptions, seismic faults, even stray voltage. None fit. The pulse registered too precisely, at exact intervals, almost deliberate. He went on to note, almost apologetically, "It reminded me of the synchronized frequencies the laboratory once described during those old Whitaker investigations, though no one here would know her name." By the early 1940s, as war effort industries flourished in the region, federal geologists returned to the Tennessee Valley to test water tables and sediment. One, Dr. Raymond Collier, recorded an odd sample retrieved from the newly formed shoreline, a slick of mineral residue that glowed faintly blue when disturbed. His report attributed it to reflections from aluminum particulates, yet his private notes confessed uncertainty. He underlined one sentence: "The light seems self-sustaining, as if awakened by contact." That same year, a fisherman named Elmer Dade filed a brief statement with county authorities, claiming he had seen a woman walking along the surface of the lake at dusk, carrying a lantern under the waterline. His story was dismissed, said as a dream brought on by exhaustion, but his family swore he had returned from the lake half frozen, his eyes unfocused, whispering she was measuring something. They moved away soon after, and the incident became another unverified tale in a valley already full of them. During wartime, the region's new factories expanded toward the ridges. Night shifts meant long hours under artificial light, but even then, workers reported brief outages followed by flickers of blue radiance through the fog. Supervisors blamed faulty transformers, yet the pattern always pointed toward the old submersion site. When one technician plotted the timing of those outages, he found a curious alignment. The intervals matched the same 73-second rhythm that Inspector Lomax had written about in 1933. The finding was quietly buried in an internal maintenance memo. For the next decade, the phenomenon persisted only in whispers. Few dared revisit the history of ponding or its vanished inhabitant. The TVA had other priorities, and to the rest of the world, Nora Whitaker had never existed. But the rhythm continued, echoing through the waters of the Tennessee Valley, measured, patient, and strangely alive. And some said, when the fog hung heavy over the reservoir, you could still see the faintest gleam where the ridge once stood, a blue shimmer that pulsed like the breath of the earth itself. By 1947, nearly a decade after the reservoir swallowed the remnants of ponding, the Tennessee Valley had grown into a model of post-war optimism. New highways crossed the once secluded ridges, and electricity had reached every farm and household. Yet beneath that progress, the old unease remained, not in the newspapers or official records, but in the quiet language of those who lived along the water's edge. Fishermen spoke of lights that drifted beneath their boats, too bright and steady to be reflections. Hikers along the ridges described faint humming beneath the soil, like a low current running through stone. Most ignored it, calling it river talk, but a handful began collecting stories again. Among them was a local historian named Ruth Calder, who had inherited a box of papers from her late uncle, the geologist Harold Finn. Inside, she found sketches of concentric rings and fragments of letters referencing resonant earth phenomena. At the bottom of the box, one brittle note caught her attention. Whitaker's formula aligns with magnetic ley lines near the ridge. Continued observation advised. Calder's curiosity became obsession. She interviewed aging residents who still remembered Nora's name and pieced together their memories. In her notes, she wrote, "Every account returns to the same sensation, a pulse beneath the land, rhythmic, measured. They speak of it as if it were a heartbeat, not a myth." She compared those testimonies with geological maps of the Tennessee Valley and discovered that the frequency of reported light disturbances aligned with known quartz deposits, a pattern eerily consistent with the placement of Nora's property before it sank. In 1949, Calder managed to secure a permit to conduct a limited dive survey in the reservoir. The project was small: 2 men, 1 rowboat, and borrowed equipment from the University of Chattanooga. On the second night, the team reported reflected illumination from the lakebed, though no artificial source was visible. Their oxygen gauges behaved erratically, and the divers surfaced early, shaken but unharmed. The official record listed the anomaly as instrument malfunction. Unofficially, one diver told Calder that he had seen a faint grid, glowing like chalk lines underwater, stretching farther than the beam could reach. After that, Calder's work abruptly ceased. Her colleagues said she became reclusive, storing her papers in sealed boxes and refusing to speak of her findings. When she passed away in 1952, her collection vanished. Some say donated, others claim confiscated by the university. Only one brief mention survives in a newspaper obituary. Local historian contributed to research on the forgotten settlements of the Tennessee Valley. And yet, in later years, her family swore that the night she died, the lake behind her house flickered with blue light. Once, steady and soft, like a signal answered after decades of silence. Whether anyone else saw it, no one can say. But by then, the name Nora Whitaker had slipped fully from official memory, known only in fragments of conversation and the hum that still rolled through the earth when the storms passed. By the mid-1950s, the Tennessee Valley was a region transformed, industry thriving, towns reborn, and the old isolation largely erased by the reach of radio and electric light. Yet even progress has its blind spots. Deep beneath the surface of the reservoir that had once been ponding, instruments began to register anomalies again, this time noticed not by locals, but by a new kind of observer. Government technicians monitoring seismic stability for nearby power facilities. One such technician, Edward Klein, filed a report in 1954 describing non-seismic rhythmic oscillations localized near the northern basin. The cycles repeated with uncanny regularity, 73 seconds apart. Klein, unaware of any historical context, suggested interference from dam turbines. His supervisor dismissed it, but the rhythm persisted, steady, measured, and unaffected by changes in current or machinery. When word of the anomaly reached a research office in Oak Ridge, a physicist named Dr. Samuel Bearden requested access to the readings. Bearden's personal notes, uncovered years later, reveal that he was familiar with the old regional folklore. Whitaker frequency? He scribbled in the margin. Match improbable but persistent. He spent the next year attempting to correlate the data with geological patterns, but found no source. If mechanical, he wrote, it is perfect in its repetition. If natural, it should not exist. During the same period, residents along the reservoir began reporting a strange echo, not of sound, but of vibration. Tools left on wooden porches rattled lightly every minute or so, as if responding to a pulse too low to hear. Local radio enthusiasts complained of static bursts interrupting evening broadcasts, always in the same pattern. Some even claimed that their appliances flickered to a dim blue glow when the interference passed. The electric company denied any fault in the grid. It was during this time that an elderly man, almost forgotten himself, re-entered the story. It was none other than Everett Lomax, the former inspector who had documented the earlier interference in 1933. Now in his 70s, he sent a handwritten letter to the TVA office. You'll find it's her rhythm again, the same as before the flood. I told them once, and they sealed it in water, but water remembers. The letter was never answered. In late autumn of 1955, after a season of unusually strong rains, maintenance workers reported faint flickers under the water near the old dam wall. They described it as lightning trapped in the lake, appearing for a few seconds, then fading to darkness. Cameras failed to capture it. Some men refused to work nights afterward, claiming the reflection followed them even when their lamps were turned off. And still, the pulse continued, unseen, unfelt by most, but steady as a hidden metronome beneath the Tennessee Valley. Engineers chalked it up to coincidence. A few, less certain, began marking their instruments with quiet dread. In January 1956, a final log entry from Klein's notebook reads simply, "The water moves before the wind does." No one ever explained what he meant. By 1957, the Valley's scientists had grown tired of unexplained data. Funding shifted toward expansion, not investigation. The steady hum beneath the reservoir was relegated to a footnote in maintenance reports, and for most people, it faded into background noise, like the static between radio stations. But among a few engineers and historians, the pattern continued to circulate, whispered half as curiosity and half as warning. One of those engineers was a young woman named Ellen Voss, assigned to assist with electrical recalibration at the northern substation. She'd grown up in Knoxville and had studied regional folklore in her spare time. The technicians found her interest amusing until she started matching their electrical fluctuations to an old article she'd found in a storage file, the 1914 investigation log of Deputy Birch. The numbers were eerily similar. In an interview, decades later, Voss recalled her realization. Every surge in the current matched the old field notes. The same 73 seconds apart, the same direction of distortion. It was as if something below the reservoir was conducting its own circuit, older and more precise than ours. When she presented her findings to her supervisor, he told her to stick to the meters and leave the ghost stories to the librarians. But she didn't. That summer, Voss traveled to the University of Tennessee to consult archived papers from Professor Lucian Greer. There, among his final sketches, she found one labeled Resonant Map, Ponding Valley. It showed the ridgelines and watercourses overlaid with concentric circles, identical to the reports from both Finn and Calder decades earlier. In the corner, in faded ink, Greer had written, "Her work continues. Frequency stable." Returning to the reservoir, Ellen began her own quiet tests. Using a hand-cranked oscilloscope, she measured current patterns NIA, or the dam's northern face. She later told a colleague that one night the waveform began to align with her heartbeat, first randomly, then perfectly. The reading lasted 3 minutes before cutting out. "It was like it knew I was watching," she said years later. Her last recorded memo, filed on October 19, 1957, reads, "Pattern constant even when main grid offline. Must originate from subsurface, possibly artifact of Whitaker experiment." It was signed neatly, then followed by one unfinished sentence. She saw light not as a wave, but as memory. Shortly after that entry, Ellen Voss disappeared. Her car was found at the overlook above the reservoir, engine cold, driver's door open. The shoreline below showed no disturbance, no footprints. Her notes were recovered from the passenger seat, the ink still fresh. The TVA classified her case as accidental fall, presumed drowned. Yet divers found nothing. Some say the instruments below the dam flickered erratically that night, a brief deviation from the 73-second rhythm, as if acknowledging her absence. The cycle resumed the next morning, unbroken. And once again, the story of Nora Whitaker, the girl who outsmarted every scientist, claimed another who tried to understand her. Winter came early in 1958, and the Tennessee Valley sank under long stretches of fog that rolled down from the mountains like slow rivers. The reservoir, calm and silvery, became a mirror to the clouds. Locals said the lake grew restless again that year, rippling without wind, as if stirred from below. Only a few remembered the connection, the rhythm, the disappearances, the legend of a girl whose experiments had outlived her century. An internal TVA memo dated February 3, 1958, refers to persistent harmonic interference near the northern dam face. The language was dry and technical, but one handwritten note in the margin stood out. Possible source, Voss's coordinates. That note was later struck through in red ink. Engineers, wary of reopening the investigation, instead installed new grounding lines and filed the matter away. But privately, one supervisor admitted to his team that the interference sounded like breathing when amplified. At the same time, a local radio host from Huntsville, Frank Latham, began broadcasting a late-night program called Echoes from the Valley. His show focused on regional mysteries, strange lights, disappearances, the shifting folklore that haunted the old river towns. In one episode, Latham interviewed a retired fisherman who had lived near the reservoir since the 1930s. The old man's voice trembled as he described blue shimmer under the ice and figures that look up when the water clears. The recording still exists today, archived at the University of Alabama. Just before the broadcast ends, Latham's microphone picks up a faint tone, low, rhythmic, pulsing every 73 seconds. Listeners wrote letters asking if it had been part of the program's sound effects. Latham replied the next week that it hadn't. "We heard it through the floor," he said, "not the equipment." That same winter, tremors shook the valley. Too weak to be earthquakes, too regular to be coincidence. A series of maintenance reports noted slight vibrations along the power conduits and shifts in the dam's metal reinforcements. The engineers called it thermal settling, but those familiar with the old records began whispering again that Nora's work, or whatever was left of it, had adapted, that it was no longer an echo of light, but a pulse buried in metal and stone. In March, one maintenance diver claimed to have seen a glow beneath the silt. Not a reflection, but a grid, geometric and perfect, like a lattice of glass veins embedded in the rock. He reached out with his gloved hand, and the light dimmed instantly. When he resurfaced, his depth gauge spun without reason. He refused to dive again. By then, the old-timers in the nearby towns refused to mention Nora's name at all. They spoke instead of the hum, or the water's heart. To them, the Tennessee Valley had become alive, not in a spiritual sense, but in a quiet, thinking way. It remembered. And when the storms came, they said, it spoke. By 1959, the Tennessee Valley had become a place of quiet prosperity. Its new industries humming, its waterways shimmering beneath the newly modern skyline. But beneath that progress, the pulse continued. Most had forgotten it by name, but for a few who worked nights near the reservoir, it was impossible to ignore. One of them, a night shift operator named George Callow, worked at a relay substation overlooking the dam. His job was routine, monitoring gauges, logging voltage changes, until he began noticing a fluctuation that returned every 73 seconds, exact to the decimal. At first, he thought it was a mechanical fault. Then one evening, while adjusting the frequency meter, he realized something chilling. The fluctuation stopped when he spoke aloud. He tested it again. Each time he whispered, the hum paused, just for a heartbeat, then resumed, as if listening. He wrote a brief note in his log that night. Pattern reactive to voice. Possibly harmonic interference. No mechanical cause. He told no one, fearing ridicule. But over the following weeks, the interference spread across other monitoring stations. Static filled radio lines. The engineers began muting their headsets during night shifts, claiming the sound felt like it was in the skull, not the ears. At the same time, researchers in nearby Oak Ridge recorded subtle magnetic deviations that mirrored the same pulse frequency. Their report referenced earlier anomalous readings from decades prior. The same buried phenomena that had first puzzled investigators studying the Tennessee Valley's terrain. One scientist, reviewing those files, underlined a phrase in an old notebook from Professor Greer. Resonance does not end. It remembers its initiator. That spring, a violent thunderstorm struck the region. Lightning hit the reservoir repeatedly, and witnesses along the shoreline later swore that each strike was followed by a second flash beneath the water, blue and diffuse, pulsing outward like breath from a submerged heart. The dam's turbines briefly failed, then restarted on their own before manual override. The official report attributed it to electrical feedback. Unofficially, one operator admitted, it was like the system took over for us. 3 nights later, George Callow was found outside the relay building, unconscious but alive. He had no memory of collapsing, but his last recorded entry, written in uneven handwriting, read, "The frequency shifted, slower, almost human." When asked what he meant, he said only that he'd heard a voice from inside the hum. His colleagues thought he'd suffered stress or exhaustion, but his ears bled for days after the event, with no medical explanation. By midsummer, the pattern stabilized again, back to 73 seconds. The engineers stopped discussing it, fearful of losing their posts. But a new rumor spread quietly through the valley, that the hum had begun to move, not just through metal and water, but through air, through the electric lines themselves, traveling further each month, carried by the same current that once brought light to the hills. And in that hum, those who listened too long said they could hear something faintly rhythmic, a breath, a pulse, and once every 73 seconds, a whisper that almost formed a name. By the turn of 1960, the story of the Tennessee Valley's hum had become a superstition again, something whispered about by linemen and river workers, passed off as a joke to newcomers. But in certain technical offices, the data continued to circulate quietly. Charts showing repeating voltage anomalies, sonar traces that pulsed like clockwork, all aligned with the same ancient rhythm. To most, it was background noise. To a few, it was proof that something beneath the reservoir had not stopped working. That winter, a new series of power tests brought a research vessel from the Army Corps of Engineers onto the lake. Its mission was to chart sediment displacement and evaluate dam integrity. The crew used low-frequency sonar, sweeping the lake bed in regular arcs. On their third night, the recorder captured a return pattern no one expected, a symmetrical structure embedded deep beneath the silt. The sonar image showed 3 concentric rings surrounding a void, each ring reflecting differently from natural rock. When amplified, the echo formed a faint tone, low, melodic, and steady at 73-second intervals. The lead engineer, Captain Douglas Haynes, logged the reading but marked it artifact interference. His first mate, however, later wrote in his journal, "The sound didn't echo off the bedrock. It answered us. The tone changed whenever we adjusted the sweep angle, like it was aware we were watching." Within days, the team requested permission to lower divers. The proposal was denied. The area was reclassified as structurally unstable and cordoned off by floating markers. The sonar records were filed, but a copy of the audio survived, later circulating among amateur researchers. Listeners described the recording as like a heartbeat slowed to stone. Meanwhile, reports from residents along the northern shore began again. They spoke of light behind fog during storms, diffuse and silent, lingering over the lake's surface for minutes before fading. One farmer swore that, late one night, he saw shapes walking beneath the water, their outlines glowing faintly, like lanterns sinking in slow motion. When he tried to photograph them, his camera failed. The film developed blank white. By 1961, the government built a new relay tower on the ridge above the dam. Technicians installing the first circuit lines reported hearing a steady vibration through the soles of their boots, even before power was connected. One described it as like standing on a throat mid-breath. And still, the hum continued, unchanged, patient, and now stronger than ever recorded. The old-timers began to say it wasn't the valley that remembered Nora Whitaker anymore, but the current itself. The machines she'd outsmarted, the scientists she'd baffled, had all become part of her system now, carrying her rhythm across every wire that reached the hills. Late that year, a maintenance worker shut down the northern substation for inspection. When the turbines stopped, the gauges still flickered. Power should have been dead, but the frequency remained alive. One line from his report, handwritten and underlined twice, remains inexplicable. "We cut the current, but the current didn't cut us." By 1962, the hum had become almost mythological, not a topic for scientists or engineers, but for those who'd lived long enough to remember the valley before the water came. The new generation didn't believe the stories, though they'd occasionally feel their floorboards tremble during storms and joke, "That's just Nora checking the lights." The older ones didn't laugh. That spring, a small landslide exposed part of the old ridge on the northern shore, where the waterline had receded after a dry season. A local boy, exploring the area, found what he thought was driftwood, but later turned out to be a section of carved timber, perfectly preserved under layers of clay. County authorities identified it as part of a foundation beam, the last remnant of the Whitaker cabin. Inside a hollowed groove in the wood, they discovered a corroded metal plate covered in shallow etchings. Under magnification, the markings formed a repeating spiral, precise, mechanical, too regular to be random. When a technician shined a light across its surface, the grooves shimmered faintly blue for a few seconds before dulling again. The plate was sent to a laboratory in Knoxville, but it never reached its destination. The courier reported that the truck's instruments failed halfway along the mountain pass, compass spinning, headlights flickering in rhythm with an unseen pulse. When he arrived, the crate was empty. He claimed the metal vibrated itself out of the box. Officials wrote it off as a hoax, but the report remains filed among missing property cases. Around that same time, a TVA archivist reviewing old correspondence rediscovered a letter written in 1915 by Professor Greer, the same one who had first studied Nora's cellar. The letter, long misfiled, contained only a single line beneath his signature. If she succeeded, the valley itself will never sleep. And so it didn't. In July, a regional power failure blacked out 5 counties. Every turbine at the northern dam halted simultaneously, but their control panels continued to display live current, an impossibility. For 21 minutes, the entire valley resonated with a soft vibration, felt even through the ground. Witnesses described dishes rattling, dogs whining, and the sensation of breath on the back of the neck, though the air was still. Then, as abruptly as it began, the lights returned, brighter than before. Engineers blamed a synchronization glitch, yet the gauges afterward showed perfect calibration, as though the system had corrected itself. One senior technician reportedly muttered, "It fixed us faster than we fixed it." In the weeks following, the hum became more distinct. Fishermen said they could hear it through the oars, a steady pulse that seemed to grow louder when they drifted toward the middle of the lake. On moonless nights, the water shimmered faintly. Not reflected light, but something beneath, faint and pulsing. That autumn, the newspapers published a short, easily missed column. Unexplained electromagnetic fluctuations recorded near dam. Authorities investigating. The article mentioned no names, no history, no legend, but to those who still remembered, it was enough. The girl who outsmarted every scientist hadn't vanished. She'd simply moved into the current, the metal, and the breath of the Tennessee Valley itself. By the winter of 1964, the hum had become indistinguishable from progress itself. Power stations grew noisier, turbines roared, and the pulse that had once unsettled a handful of technicians was now buried beneath 1,000 legitimate sounds of industry. Yet when storms rolled down through the Tennessee Valley, there were still moments, brief and uncanny, when everything else would go still. No machinery, no wind, no rain. Just that soft, low vibration rising from below, steady and patient, as though waiting to be acknowledged. The last official document to mention the anomaly appeared that year in a quiet appendix to a maintenance report. The line reads simply, "System frequency stable. Irregular resonance persists, within tolerances." It was the bureaucratic equivalent of surrender. But the story didn't end with the paperwork. A journalist named Henry Morton, researching regional folklore, came across the Whitaker name in an archived sermon from 1915. He followed the trail back through forgotten letters, missing case files, and rural legends. After months of research, he concluded that every account, from the missing boy Samuel Reeves to the later interference at the dam, shared one precise detail: the same repeating interval of 73 seconds. Morton wrote a draft article titled "The Pulse Beneath the Valley," intending to submit it to a regional historical journal. He never did. Neighbors said Morton began spending long nights parked by the reservoir, tape recorder running, waiting for proof. His last entry in a notebook, later recovered from his car, reads, "It's closer tonight, not a hum anymore, a breath, and behind it, words I can almost make out." He was found the next morning, slumped in the driver's seat, alive but unresponsive. The tape was still running. The final minute captures wind, water, and something faint beneath them. A low voice. Counting, though the numbers are broken by static. Every 73 seconds, the same tone returns, patient and precise. The experts who analyzed the recording dismissed it as electrical interference, but those who listened closely said the voice was female, calm, rhythmic, almost curious. After that, the valley's story went silent. Files were boxed, equipment replaced, and the water level rose again, hiding what remained of the ridge forever. By the time modern researchers revisited the area decades later, even the outlines of the old foundation were gone, replaced by sediment and root. And yet, those who live along the lake still tell newcomers not to whistle during storms. They say the water listens. They say it doesn't like being called by name. On certain nights, when the fog lies thick and the power lines hum, they claim you can hear a soft pulse under the earth, faint but exact, as if someone, somewhere, is still conducting an invisible experiment that never truly ended. Every 73 seconds, still measuring, still listening, still remembering. The Tennessee Valley sleeps, but it breathes in rhythm with her.